Greetings, everyone. On behalf of the Center for First Generation Student Success and the Council for Opportunity in Education, I welcome you all to the 2022 First Generation College Celebration virtual event. My name is Sarah Whitley, and I serve as Vice President with the Center for First Generation Student Success at NASPA. And like many of you, I am a proud First Generation college graduate. As you know, the First Generation College Celebration takes place each year on November 8th. It is the national event to raise awareness around the first generation college student identity and experience. This year marks our 6th annual First Generation College Celebration, advancing an asset-based national narrative on first generation undergraduate and graduate student experiences, as well as the many faculty and staff across the nation who identify as first gen. Colleges and universities are filled with millions of first generation college students actively seeking certificates, credentials, and degrees with the dream of bettering their own lives and the lives of their families and communities. We know the pandemic was especially hard on first generation students, and we are seeing university leaders galvanize efforts toward dismantling systemic barriers, elevating scalable supports, and positioning first generation students for success both during college and in their futures. First generation college students comprise a deeply intersectional population across higher ed and represent a diversity of races, ethnicities, sexual orientation, income status, part and full-time employees, veterans, undocumented students, and that's really just the beginning. While higher education may be seeing a decline in enrollment, the number of first-gen students entering college continues to climb, and it's really the responsibility of the higher education community to provide every possible pathway for these talented students to be successful. That's why National First Generation College Celebration is important. While it absolutely should be a celebration and a whole lot of fun, it is also a way to elevate data regarding first-generation student needs, anchor efforts to the university strategic plan, and position senior leaders to prioritize this important work. As we investigate those first-generation students entering higher education, we clearly see a growing number of adult learners. These are students who are entering education a bit later in life, often after the age of 23 or 24, in pursuit of new opportunities, expanded knowledge, or a career change. Adult learners bring a wealth of ideas and experiences to our communities, but are often attending classes while employed, caring for family members, raising children, navigating military service, and much more. With nearly half of currently enrolled students identifying as adult learners, placing focus on the experiences of this population is both timely and necessary. I am really excited for you to hear from our talented panel today and hope each of you will take what you learn and implement within your own communities. I wish each of you a very happy National First Generation College Celebration, and I'm grateful for your time and efforts in supporting this very important population. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing you to my friend and colleague, Kimberly Jones, who serves as the Executive Vice President and now President-elect of the Council for Opportunity in Education.
Thank you, Sarah. It is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Brenda Dann-Messier. Brenda worked at Education Strategy Group from 2015 through 2017 as a senior advisor and coach for the New Skills for Youth initiative, and has returned to ESG as a senior advisor. In 2017, Brenda was appointed Rhode Island's post-secondary commissioner and served as commissioner until 2019. From 2009 through 2014, Brenda served in the Obama administration as the Assistant Secretary for Career, Technical, and Adult Education. And from 2013 and 2014 was also the Acting Assistant Secretary for Post-Secondary Education. Prior to her time at the U.S. Department of Education, Brenda was the president of Dorcas Place Adult and Family Learning Center for a decade and directed 2 TRIO programs at the Community College of Rhode Island, including serving as the director of the Educational Opportunity Center in Rhode Island. Brenda is a board member of the National Skills Coalition, Rhode Island's Commerce Corporation, and president of the Reentry Campus Program Board. She holds a doctorate from Johnson & Wales University and a master's and bachelor's degree from Rhode Island College. Please join me in offering a virtual welcome to Brenda Dann-Messier.
Thank you very much, Kim, for that lovely introduction. I'm looking forward to today's panel. I want to thank all of you for participating in the webinar. As a professional who works with adults and has for my entire career, I'm pleased we're focusing today's webinar on first-generation adult learners with our distinguished panelists. As we jump into the first question, our panelists will share information about their backgrounds, offering critical insights into the ways they support and advocate for first-generation adult learners. Vanessa, we're going to start with you. Understanding definitions are important and helps us to think about connections. What does it mean to identify as a first-generation adult learner? Are there other intersectional and social cultural identities we must consider, and why?
Good afternoon, Brenda. Thank you so much. And I want to thank my fellow panelists as well for this conversation that we're about to engage in this afternoon. My name is Vanessa Sheared, and for the past year, I served as the board president 2021-22 of the American Association for the Adult Continuing Education. And I now am serving as past president of the board. I have over 30 years of experience in the field of adult education as an administrator, faculty member in public and private universities, vocational and technical colleges, community-based and nonprofit organizations, and have served as an alcoholism counselor and a student support services counselor in the TRIO program and social worker for Head Start and Catholic Charities. In addition to my work experience, I have served as a board member on foundations, community-based and nonprofit organizations. I've been a guest speaker at international, national, state, and local conferences, and conducted research and taught in the areas of race, class, language, and gender, policy and leadership, instructional and funding strategies, and used an Afrocentric womanist perspective to guide my work. My publications include work that is being published in May of 2023, Diversity of Learners and Learning in a Globalized World, which will be published in Meeting Adult Learning Needs and Learning Contexts. I co-edited the Handbook on Race and Adult Education, a resource for dialogue on racism in 2010. And I co-edited the book Making Space, Merging Theory to Practice with Peggy Sissel in 2001. And in Welfare Reform, Race, Class, and Gender, the Elusive Quest for Self-Determination. In addition to my service, I am also currently serving as board president for executive director for the Closing the Gap in Sacramento, California. I'm very pleased to be able to just come to this table today and just talk a little bit about first generation experiences for college students. First, I'd like to start by saying that the question that I asked myself when we began this conversation is, who am I and why is this important to me? And why should it matter to anyone else? And so as I think about that, I thought, well, let's talk about it from this perspective that I am a first generation student. And as a first generation student, I come to this conversation with a set of lived experiences that I think will help us and help those who are listening to us really begin to see that even though you may be a first generation student, and we're a first generation student, we're really talking about someone whose parents never went to college, and they are the first ones to actually walk into the college setting, whether it's in a community college or in a four-year institution. And with that comes a whole host of experiences and fears and concerns. And as I think about that for myself, I know that when I entered into the university or college at Wheaton College in 1974, it was one of the most scariest moments in my life to walk into that space in what was predominantly a white institution and also in a community that was not like my own. And so for me, that was one of those things where I wonder, why am I here and will I be able to be successful? I'm here to tell those who are first generation students that even with all of that, I am here today and I have served as a dean of a university, college of education in 2 different settings. I have worked as an administrator in a community college system. So wherever you start, if you start as a first generation student, that doesn't stop you from being and becoming that which you hope to become. So today, what we're going to talk about are some of the trials and the struggles that first generation students go through, but we're also going to talk about the successes and the opportunities that you will have by going into this college setting. You don't have to fear it. It's something that we all have been through, and we are here to tell you that you too can make it through this maze, through this journey, and you will be able to navigate this just like we have. So thank you for the time, and I'm looking forward to the other comments from our panelists.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Matt, you're up next to answer the question.
Thanks, Brenda, and thanks, Vanessa, for sharing your amazing story. I myself as well am a first-generation low-income student from Appalachia, and being that student, I kind of I understand where these populations are coming from. At 17 years old, I had a child. I had to drop out of high school. I had to get a job and take care of my family. And so my parents didn't have any education. My dad was in the military. My mom was a stay-at-home mother. And nobody really thought that, that's what your next step was. And so luckily for me, I met an educational opportunity academic coordinator, and they were able to assist me with getting my GED, and then taking me to campus, doing a tour and trying to figure out what is next best for me. Once I went to go register, you show up in this very large auditorium, and there's thousands of people there, and it's extremely scary, and I didn't know what to do. And like my first thought was, hey, maybe I should just not do this because I got a child to worry about. This atmosphere, these places are not right for me. And so that's one of the things that we have to worry about when we're talking about first generation students, is there is nobody to show them the right path to walk in their family, because nobody's ever done it. And so, without, practitioners out there that can help them make this journey, I wouldn't be able to be the director of educational opportunity centers at Morehead State University and work for an amazing organization of TRIO, and, work on my doctorate degree, which hopefully I'll finish in May. So, that is something that we as practitioners need to focus on, about being that buffer zone, being that provider, being that guider throughout the journey. There's part of this question that's really interesting about other social cultural identities that are out there. And I know, being a low-income first-generation student, you usually, like a lot of times, you'll have also imposter syndrome. I greatly have imposter syndrome. No matter what I do or what I've done, I don't ever feel like I belong. So we always have to be mindful about that, because if a student suffers, or an adult suffers from imposter syndrome, they will never feel comfortable in the place that they're at. They'll never think that college is right for them, or these praises or this opportunity is right for them. And so they will try to, hide in the shadows and step away from that and not be present and not be heard. And we need more people that come from this background to be able to uplift the others that are in the same positions that they were just a few years ago. Another group of social cultural identities that we also need to focus on is those that are in the LGBTQ plus community with first generation. So not only are they having to deal with the hard journey that is the first generation path of being the only one in your family that goes to college, but now they also have another social issue, that they need guidance with, that makes them also stand out. Myself, I have a trans male 16-year-old, and he's about to go through this journey. Luckily for him, he's not first generation, and I can help him with it, but he has several friends that are suffering the same boat. And so that is just another barrier, another, something that's going to get in their way, because that community is not completely fully accepted as well. So anything that we can do as practitioners and leaders, and to help grow the educational sphere for these populations, we have to do it, because we are the steward of education, and we need to be there for them.
Thank you very much, Matt, and congratulations, because you are now the director of the same EOC program that you went through that helped you to get into college. And what an inspiration you must be to your students. So that's wonderful. Kelly, I want to turn it to you to answer the question.
Thank you, Brenda. And I have to be honest, I feel like my imposter syndrome is coming through, because I'm honored to be on this panel with to folks who are just doing incredible work around this. So I want to put that out there. And I share that because I too am really called to be a part of this because of my first gen identity. It's the hat that I wear in every meeting that I'm in as a higher ed practitioner. So it's something that I celebrate. It was something that was hard, but it's something that I really can see and take pride in. So I'm Kelly Brochu. My pronouns are she and her, and I currently serve as assistant to the president for special projects at Regis College in Massachusetts. And in that role, a really significant and special project is supporting the president in creating and cultivating these avenues for adult learners to re-engage into higher education, from our Division of Professional Studies to all the different pieces of work that are happening across the institution. That's something that I'm really called to do. And I'm fortunate that I'm a part of an institution that's leadership is also called to do that too with our mission. So very grateful for that. In addition, I've worn a lot of hats across higher ed. I've been really grateful that I recently defended my dissertation back in April through the Higher Education Leadership EDD program at Regis College. And my dissertation was focused specifically on the adult learner as that graduate student and the strategies and support systems that allow them to persist through role conflict. So this has been something from a research standpoint that I've been really fortunate to contribute to literature, but also glean a lot from it. Along with that, I am proudly serving as the Region 1 representative for the adult learner and students with children knowledge community. So really happy to represent Region 1 in that regard. And then finally, teaching a course called The Psychology of Learning for the Adult Learner in the EDD program at Regis College. So educating around that work, bringing it back to NASPA, but most importantly, learning a lot from folks around me because I identify as first gen. I have been the adult learner through my graduate education. And there are a lot of layers to those two identities. The imposter syndrome is real. And for me personally, there's been that real urgency and that charge to do well and to really set myself as a role model for folks around me and the students that align with those identities. Brenda brings up a great point. How do we define the adult learner in the first gen space? And what I would say is, and some of you may have seen the Post-Traditional Learners Manifesto from ACE, and there are a variety of definitions. There are so many ways that folks are defining post-traditional learner, adult learner. And what I would say is I glean back to Malcolm Knowles' andragogy and looking at those principles. These are folks that have self-concept. They have this reservoir of experience that it's a resource towards that learning, and they're ready, they're motivated to learn. So those are the students coming in, the adults that are really ready to go, and their life experience should be really integrated into the curriculum, into the work that we do, and it needs to be valued and accentuated alongside the valued efforts and the greatness that is being first gen.
Thank you very much, Kelly. We heard mention of structures and barriers and how institutions of higher education create an environment that can be conducive and welcoming to first generation learners. Can you talk a little bit about that, Matt? How do you make an institution welcoming to first generation adult learners?
Yeah, sure, Brenda. Thank you. So one of the big things I think that most institutions should always be mindful about being is inclusive. In the 1800s and early 20th century, the higher halls of learning always seemed like they just wanted to keep people out. As we grow as a society and, our population changes and education is becoming a little bit more available to the masses, we need to make sure that we are inclusive to all sorts of populations and all types of different cultural aspects. And so if a university can be mindful about being inclusive, set up programs, we have to identify if we are first generation on the financial aid application. And most institutions also ask that same question to identify as first generation. Yes, not everybody knows what it means to be first generation. But if a university or a college could create a organization or an outreach program to assist these first generation students as they're coming in, or as these adult learners are coming in, that would go a long way to increase the amount of population that they can serve, and would also help lower the first generation rate throughout our country, because all it takes is one person to graduate and have kids, and then those kids are no longer first generation. So it's very important to do that. Also establish a lot of universities throughout the country and community colleges have something called TRIO programs. So I work for the organization Educational Opportunity Outreach Centers, which helps adult learners go to college, which is under the banner of TRIO. TRIO is an amazing program. We have amazing outreach, different programs throughout. And so if you have one in your area, that institution should utilize those coordinators, that director, those counselors to reach out to that population, because most of them, like myself, have been in their shoes before and understand what it means to be low income, be an adult learner, having that imposter syndrome and other barriers that stop you from going to college. So if a university can be inclusive and utilize different community partners like TRIO itself to help get that population in, that is one way to help eliminate the high percentage of first generation and maybe even get rid of it.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Matt. Kelly, I want to turn it to you to answer the question. What can you do at your institution to be more adult friendly?
Thank you. And I echo Matt's sentiment. The inclusive piece is the top item to note through this answer to the question. So I appreciate that sentiment. When I think about answering this and what can higher education do, I think back to my research on that adult learner. And while it's in the graduate student space, it still really rings true based on my own practice with our adult learners, with first-gen students collectively. And so what I found in this research, and that is entitled Wearing Multiple Hats Towards the Graduation Cap, Navigating Role Conflict in a Master's Degree in Higher Education, we know our adult learners are wearing all of these hats. They are caretakers, they're parents, they're students, they're employees. They're trying to have a personal life. That would be really great too. And so in navigating all of these pieces, there's that experience of role conflict. And there are various ways to cope through. And through my study, the support systems that my participants found helpful were things such as drawing an intentional connection to curriculum practice. How are you utilizing that time really wisely for students where in that classroom, time is precious? And so when they're entering that space, really making sure that there's that connection to the career trajectory and elevation and other items such as that yearning to learn. Even that sentiment around participants wanted those to seek to understand the graduate student experience. They wanted their faculty, their advisors to learn more about them and the roles that they occupy. Something as simple as acknowledgement and wanting to learn more about their student was something that would be in itself a support that institutions could bring back to the adult learner. And this segues to that imposter syndrome for the first-gen adult learner. Having someone to reach out and take a moment to really unpack and to listen, that could be such a huge step. We have a lot of meetings. We are very busy as higher education practitioners, but that 10-minute meeting to ask, tell me about you, what's your story? That could really just go miles. And then I think, of course, folks who prioritize well-being, self-care, is that incorporated into your curriculum? Certain moments, even a moment to level set and reflect. Flexible and realistic expectations. Can you look through the curriculum and find maybe there is another time frame that works best for the folks in my classroom? And then finally, that investment in learning and career development. Those are the things that optimize on the adult learner's time and space, because whether it's re-entering higher education or entering for the first time, that's a big step and a big undertaking. And so for that to be utilized wisely would be immensely valuable to our adult learners. So those are definitely some of the pieces that I would bring into answering this question.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing all those points. Vanessa, from your vast experiences, what would you share with our audience today?
I agree with what Kelly and Matthew have both said in terms of the imposter syndrome and the need to be inclusive. One of the things that I think that I would add to that is that we oftentimes talk about the institution being inclusive. The institution is made up of people. The people need to be inclusive. And so one of the things that I've learned over the years is that the reason that so many students struggle, especially first generation students struggle, is that while we talk about inclusion, they don't see themselves ever. They don't see themselves in the instructors. They don't see themselves in the people who are advising them oftentimes. So there is a need for us to not only look at being inclusive of the various differences that the students bring to the table, but also looking at what is it that's going on in the institution that could help those students see themselves. Well, what would help is that we need to start looking at the hiring practices in our institutions, look at the students that we're bringing into the institution and making sure that there is a diversity of thought, not only in terms of how we hire and who we hire, but also in terms of the curriculum that we develop. Do they see themselves in the curriculum at all? And what does that look like when you see yourself in that curriculum? I know for me, when I went to Wheaton College that first year, it was predominantly a white institution. All the instructors were white. And I remember being brought into a space with one of the deans and him saying something like, well, you know, bringing us little girls into the room and to talk about, well, why were we talking about the need for a student organization for urban leadership? We were from the city. And we learned that what had happened there many years ago in that institution is that they had brought in a group of Black students because it mattered to the institution to diversify back in the 60s. And then they all kind of left. But then the question then was, then they decided to bring in students who weren't as actively in terms of civic minded, or so they thought. We weren't going to speak back. But then we started talking about this urban leadership thing. So people needed to understand that. Why is it so important for us to have that space? Oftentimes what happens is people start saying that, you know, why do those students have to have a space to themselves? Well, they need to have a space so they can begin to talk about things that matter to them, so that they can begin to feel connected. So I think those are the things that institutions need to give thought to, making sure that they have done all the work. TRIO programs are a great example of being able to do that, but it's also one of those things that can isolate you because now you're seen as different. So how now do I become a part of the rest of the campus becomes the question. So there are so many factors.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. You know, I think it's so important that all three of you really talked about how essential it is to listen to our students, to hear our students, and to then adapt our practice based on what our students need. So thank you all three very much. There are multiple opportunities for re-engaging adult students. Some institutions focus on those that have some college and no degree. Others focus on adult learners who only have a high school diploma or its equivalency. Can you talk about ways from your own experiences that you've engaged or re-engaged adult learners? Kelly, I'm going to start with you.
Sure, thank you. And I think as folks are listening to this too, it's important to first and foremost circle back to some great sentiments from Vanessa and Matt, where the inclusion training for staff and faculty and folks who are part of the enrollment process too for adult learners, I think is the first and foremost piece for re-engagement. There's really good intent, yet if we're lacking the education and we're making assumptions about the student who is expressing interest in the institution, we need to make sure that we're really being mindful of how you're marketing and really promoting an inclusive space for all learners, including that adult learner specifically. So I would put that out there first and foremost. I know For me, the things that come to my mind are some of the support systems items that should be, in addition to being inclusive within your recruitment, you need to deliver that inclusive practice. So that's another sentiment that's really critical that comes to mind for me. I've been really fortunate in my work where, going back to that question of, how are we re-engaging? A lot of that goes back to collaboration, not only within your institution, but also with your partnerships externally. So there are really strategic partnerships that can allow you to bring in folks from different organizations that perhaps they're fully employed, and there are folks around your institution who are continuing to nourish and foster those relationships with external partnerships that could also really support adult learners that are working in those spaces, but perhaps want to have a new opportunity or elevate their career. So I've been really grateful in my role to be looking at professional studies, different programming opportunities, certificates, other items that can allow someone to elevate their education, but also do it accessibly, whether there's discounts or other opportunities across partnership with that work. I think in addition to, it's also looking at different professional organizations that are specifically looking and saying, we are here to support and fund and whether it's grant opportunities, et cetera, for workforce development need. So that's helping the adult learner. It's also helping institutions, and it's also aligning with the workforce development needs that we're seeing today. So those are some things that come to mind from my role, at least from the president's office. Beyond that too, your leadership is so important in this case. And so some of you who are listening may be a part of that executive leadership. Some of you may be entry level or mid-level. You all have that voice, and that you should be always bringing into the forefront how to figure out pathways to re-engage adult learners. I'm grateful though, where I work for a president that looks at the 39 million Americans that did not complete their degree. So they started college and they didn't complete it. And there are some that may make assumptions and say that was due to other reasons or a dearth of motivation, when our president has publicly shared in speaking engagements that it means higher education needs to do better. It means that higher education needs to create the pathways to come back. So a part of that also is to re-engage your students. It's holding yourself accountable and thinking of how do you better engage and retain the adult learner? And especially as we're thinking about the first gen adult learner, thinking about the resources that you could be bringing into the fold that could allow them not only to be enrolled and engaged, but also to persist. It's incumbent on you as the institution. If you're going to enroll someone, you should have those supports for the adult learner, and you should do everything you can to keep them retained so that way they can get that degree and make the dream work professionally and co-curricular wise.
Those are excellent points. Thank you very much, Kelly. Vanessa, how would you answer that question?
Thanks, Brenda. I agree with what Kelly just mentioned in terms of just really making sure that there are structures and things that are put in place in the institution to help guide the students along the path, especially those students who are returning students, or when we talk about re-engaging those students in the learning environment. I think that in addition to that, we also just need to begin to look at the curriculum more closely. I think we really do need to look at that. I can't stress that enough, the curriculum, and also think about professional development for those who are going to be serving this population. I think that those are things that we oftentimes forget, and when we bring students into our spaces in higher ed, we oftentimes say that they're the ones who need to make the adjustment. And we spend a lot of times working on helping them adjust to the structure that is, rather than thinking about, is this structure really conducive to everyone who we're trying to engage in this learning space? One of the things that we oftentimes ask of programs and institutions in adult ed is who participates and why, and who benefits from the participation. Those are questions that we need to ask ourselves as we begin to plan out programs for students who we want to serve. And we have to ask ourselves, are these the students that we want in our classroom spaces? I say that only because I remember being in conversations when I was in one of the institutions where we were looking at remediation math for students. We often talk about first generation students having limited skill sets in math, in English, in writing. And so oftentimes they are put in those remedial programs. Well, one of the things that I heard faculty members saying is, if they're going to be in the university, then they should already have these skills. Why do we have to have these remediation classrooms and programs for them? They struggle with that very question. And at the same time, we're talking about the need for inclusion and making sure that people have that space. And not all first generation students need to go into remediation. All too often, sometimes people make those assumptions. So we have to really give thought to that when we look at students who are first generation students. Not all first generation students will need to be in remedial classes, but some will. And there are those students who aren't first generation who do need to be in those classes. So we start making assumptions. So I'm just saying that as we began to look at engagement, we need to look at the who is participate, who benefits, and why do we do certain things in our structures that oftentimes create barriers for our students to be successful in our classrooms. The last thing I'll say is, when we think about GED students, we really need to give thought to the fact that oftentimes they have not had all of those opportunities to work in a school setting, but sometimes they do because they go into classes. So what I found in doing research around students who participate in GED classes, as well as who ultimately come back to the university, is that they need to feel a connection. They need to feel like they matter. And if they feel like they matter, they will persist, and that is a part of it. And again, that's not necessarily an institution, that's people. It's the people. It's the people that matter. We matter. Each of us matter in these situations. The work that we've done along the way, that's what matters to students. When you hear students come back and say, what happened, what you did for me mattered, or I didn't get what you were talking about when we first talked, because oftentimes we think they need to get it the first time around, and they don't. And the light bulb comes on a little while longer, a little later in the game. So what we need to give thought to is that, our job is to introduce people to the possibilities of being able to be successful, and then giving them the tools that they need, that they're asking us for, that will help them persist and be successful in the university setting.
Thank you, Vanessa. Matt, can you share with us some strategies that you think are effective for re-engaging adult learners?
Thanks, Brenda. Sure can. Vanessa, you hit on something that really struck home with me when you talked about how adult learners are not always, remedial. A lot of people think that, maybe they come in and, they're not at the same level as the high school students coming straight out, or these GED students may not be on the same level as the high school kids. I will tell you that I had got a 32 on my ACT. And I was a GED student and an adult learner. So no, just because you're one of those two things does not mean that you're any less or any lower than the rest of the population that is there. And that is one of the other things that came to mind, was that when I got my GED, and wanted to go to college, I couldn't qualify for a lot of scholarships because I had a GED. In the state of Kentucky, we have something called Keys money, which is funded by the lottery. I didn't qualify for it. So I don't understand why we are trying to shadow or to outrid these people that, something happened in their life and that, maybe college wasn't the right place for them at that time. It also has an age limit. After so many years, it goes away. So you earn this, or you could earn this. So that is something that would be really good to do to engage this population to come back. Anytime, college is expensive. That's why we're crushed with debt, with student loan debt. So any way that we can give incentives for adult learners or GED obtainers to come in to go to college into our programs, that would be a great way to capture that population that we may not have. And just because they have a GED, or just because it's been 10, 20, 50 years since they've been in high school, that doesn't mean anything. I've met a lot of high school kids recently in my work. Listen, some of these high school kids aren't ready either. And so it's important to not stigmatize and give them a financial opportunity that they may not have. The third thing I want to talk about is something that me and Brenda have had quite many discussions about, and it's something that I'm writing my dissertation on, but capturing that prison population. In prison, there are a lot of population that are adult learners that may not have a GED, that has been first generation their whole life. We know that, first generation makes it hard to go to college. It also makes it hard to just live and be a part of life, to make the right decisions that, your parents may not have taught you how to do. And so allowing them to have second chance Pell and being eligible to go to college while they're in prison and paying back their debts to society is very important. So you can capture that low income, first generation GED adult learners through that population. And when they achieve education, even a little bit of education, recidivism rates reduced by 40%. In the first 3 years of getting out of prison, recidivism is usually around 68%. So 68% of all population that comes out of prison goes right back in within 3 years. If just a little bit of education, you can eliminate that to 40. With bachelor's, if you get master's, you can almost eliminate it to 0. And so that is another thing that we can use and utilize. And thanks to the federal government, they are implementing them back into to the college process to get this first generation adult learner population back into college and get them to help be productive members of our society.
You all three have made such excellent points how to re-engage and engage even for the first time adult learners. And I think what's important is that you need to target your communication strategy, your messaging, because everybody has different needs and different supports that they're going to need to have designed for them. And all three of you really spoke so well about that. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask each of the panelists, based on your vast experiences, if you have specific tools and resources that you use and could recommend to our audience that would really help support adult learners. And Vanessa, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Brenda. I think when I think about this question, one of the things that comes to mind is we've talked about the need for financial aid. And one of the things that we did when I was working at Sacramento State was we worked with the United Way to conduct FAFSA workshops on campus for community organizations. Because one of the thoughts we had, and we brought someone in from the federal government to come in and help us develop these workshops, and it was a train the trainer model. And those are things that can be done within institutions with community-based organizations. Those communities that are out there that are going to be the first line of resources for many of our students, because they're getting some kind of support, especially those first generation students. For example, I work with an organization called Closing the Gap, and we provide funding for nonprofit organizations in the Sacramento region. And they are working with first generation high school students who will be going off to college. There's a program called College Track. There's a program called Improve Your Tomorrow. And one of the things that they do is they provide these workshops for students and after school programs to help them prepare for college. So partnering with those kinds of organizations becomes real important. I think that's one of the things that Kelly was speaking to a little while ago, is that we really need to look at how we can partner. And so we can do that around things like workshops, FAFSA workshops, where we're getting out there and working in the churches as well as in other organizations. We oftentimes think of the school to school pipeline, but we've been talking about other pipelines that, from the prison. We don't want our kids to go into prison, but sometimes that's where they are, and we've got to be there and to be able to provide them with the resources that they need to be able to get out and go into schools. One of the other things is that we have Veterans Affairs offices on campus for people who are veterans who are coming back to school as first generation students, and they make space for those students to come into to be able to have that opportunity to talk about things that matter to them, to help them be successful. The things that Matthew talked about in terms of setting up those spaces in dorms and things like that, that speak to the various degree emphasis that students may have and that they can come together. The one thing that I'm always mindful of as I think about these various tools and possibilities is that we also have to think about factors related to race, class, and gender, all those things that oftentimes get put aside because we think that one shoe fits all, and it doesn't. So we have to think about how can we begin to develop those spaces that really are geared towards meeting the specific needs of each student, collectively and individually, as opposed to thinking about it from an academic standpoint, being able to go in there and talk about what matters to the community. So those are things that I think are helpful to bringing in that first generation and making sure that it's not just about the university being situated in some isolated space, but the university has to go out into the community. It cannot sit and think that people are going to feel like they are safe within that environment if they don't see you out there with them in the community.
Excellent point. Thank you, Vanessa. Matt?
Vanessa, you touched on something that's dear to my heart, FAFSA workshops. So usually around my area, I'm always known as like the FAFSA guy, and as educational opportunity centers, that's one of our big things that we do. And so that right there, work with TRIO. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the TRIO organizations, especially educational opportunity centers that focuses solely on adult learners. And so, like I said before, there's plenty of us out there. There's over 100 EOC programs. There's a lot more of adult, of Upward Bound and educational talent search and student support services. And so look for TRIO to help these students. Work with them. If you don't have a TRIO program at that institution, write for one. The Department of Ed, every 5 years, educational opportunity centers are up for writing. And so if you don't have that in your institution, please look to add one, because I'd love for the EOC family to grow. Also, something that I know myself, I really work with, and Vanessa had touched on it, is community action agencies and the community services block grant that the federal government has created to help support community agencies and put them all in one spot. And that way, when these adult learners, if they're looking for a LIHEAP, which is heating assistance, hey, there's somebody right beside them. I do this myself, right beside the LIHEAP line. That's like, hey, would you like to go to college? Let me tell you, it's free. I guarantee you we can get it for free, because if you can sign up for LIHEAP and heating assistance, you are definitely going to be able to get this Pell Grant, and we can get you in a community college. And so, working with those block grants and that block agencies, Veterans Affairs, going to those one-stop career service centers, disability services, just so many things. And then, just being there where they're at, being active, spreading the message. Think about where adult learners usually go, especially from low income places. They have the low income housing. You have housing agencies. They have laundry mats, because a lot of time housing agencies don't have inside laundry machines and laundry facilities. So go to laundry mats, go to check cashing places. Anywhere that population hits, you should go there. During COVID, I can't stand to sit at home and work from home. I just don't like it. I like to be out there talking to people, meeting people. And so I would go to these blood drives that they'd be having, and sit up a table outside in a park right beside a blood bank. And that way you can still reach that population. You can be outside, you can have safe social distancing, and you could help that population of adult learners of first generation foster that sense of that they belong and that education is important, and use every type of community block agency, community services that you can, because when one person's working to help somebody get into school, that's amazing. But when you got 20 other people working to help get that in school, that's even better. So just focus on anything that's out there. There's plenty of places. I believe that United Way has something called 611, so where most communities have that. services. And so you can go to that United Way's website and it'll tell you, oh, educational services. Okay, so-and-so is listed under here. Let me call them for any type of help with educational services. So if your program is not on that website, get to them. They have a way on the website to contact them, to add you to their 611 list. And so it just provides information about what's out there and where they can go.
Super, Matt. Thank you very, very, very much. Very helpful. Kelly?
So I think in addition to the awesome contributions from the fellow panelists, assessment is so critical here. We've talked throughout this panel, this event, that the various identities that adult learners hold are so eclectic and a myriad of ways. So it's important that you're finding those spaces to conduct that assessment, focus group spaces where adult learners can be heard. That was a big part of my research on the strategy side. Find those spaces where your experience can be heard and you can find that sense of community that some folks today were chatting about as well. So I think that's really important. I think in addition to, for the adult learner, both within graduate education and the undergraduate side, is looking at the professional development opportunities. So there are opportunities where really bolstering networks and identifying career need is something that, going back to some of the earlier points we've made, utilizes the time well. It's related to the career trajectory. And most importantly, it builds that sense of community and sense of belonging that a lot of us have been talking about. So there are initiatives that could really be critical there and could even incorporate a mentorship opportunity from within the institution to the greater professional areas. Those are things that I've been fortunate to be able to cultivate at my institution for graduate assistants, but other learners as well. So that's been really great and really effective. I think a couple other strategies and items that are a lot easier said than done. I think first and foremost is really doing a good reevaluation of your admissions criteria for programs. Are the things that you're requiring measure the aptitude and the ability for your learner, your prospective learner to succeed? And we're seeing that there are a lot of things that we can be looking at, but even really evaluating, removing one criteria or adapting it to really accentuate that adult learner is something that we could be thinking about, which I know is a larger task and a larger undertaking as I'm saying it out loud. But then the other part is, from a curriculum standpoint that Vanessa had mentioned earlier, how are we looking for opportunities to give credit for life and professional experience that the adult learner already has? We've talked about from andragogy, we're thinking about Malcolm Knowles and the research of this reservoir of knowledge is there. So we need to tap into that, and that's going to accentuate the classroom. It's an asset to the class. But how do we also really recognize that beyond giving some kudos for the life experience in that work? I would also say too, EAB has some good snapshots of the adult learner experience and general items where they do note just some of those priorities and items, such as they're seeking career change, they want to expand their career options, yet most importantly, other priorities can come first. So thinking about where's the access to childcare, other things across your institution, and most importantly, collaboration. Your veteran affairs, all of these departments that are serving adult learners in a myriad of ways. If your institution doesn't have a task force or a group that's convening and just level setting to make sure you're supporting that student, maybe you should be the one to inquire about it, because that in itself would be really critical to bring in all of the pieces that we've talked about today.
Excellent point, Kelly. I think all three of you really touched on some very important aspects of this work: the importance of partnerships, the importance of institutional policies, and the importance of listening to student voices. Really excellent points. Thank you very much. In our final moments, could each of you please leave our audience with one final thought about effectively serving first-generation adult learners? And Matt, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So just remember that when you have an adult learner who is a low-income first-generation student, they're already behind the 8 ball. So any support that you can give them to reach them and even give them the same footing that every other student has that's not first generation, that's what you should do. And make sure that they have support, inclusion, and you tell them that, hey, you know what, you belong here. That's the most, just let them know that they belong. They deserve to have the same opportunities that everybody else gets to have.
Thank you, Matt. Kelly?
For me, I go back to what I do is every meeting I'm in, every conversation I'm having, and every initiative I'm working to propel, I'm wearing the hat of a first generation adult learner. And so I encourage folks who share those identities or serve those individuals to think about that, because that will be really crucial in their support. And I think finally, to give grace to adult learners. The amount of roles that they're carrying, the amount that they're really prioritizing and propelling through to get their degree is immense. And that should be celebrated. And it's an asset to your classrooms, to your co-curricular spaces. And I think finally, seek to learn the adult learner experience. And that's not just one student. Really think about how you can learn more and continue to engage in that scholarship around the adult learner and the first gen identity.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Vanessa?
So those are great responses. And so one of the things that I would add is that I go back to where I started in terms of the question: who participates and why do they participate? So I think as institutions, we need to ask ourselves that question. And why do we want these students to participate in our institutions? And what do they bring, and what will we benefit from, and how will they benefit from being in our institutions? So I always start with the question, because I think in asking ourselves those critical questions, we begin to figure out think more critically about what the answer should be. The second thing I would say is that we also need to think about who are these adult learners. We've used that term liberally here in terms of what an adult learner is. And so there are ways in which we describe adult learners, whether or not they're in GED programs, or if they're coming in as traditional students, or they're coming in as non-traditional students. And then we have to look at them in terms of the social, cultural, and political capital that they bring to the table as well, because they all bring a set of experiences to the table. They're not starting from a deficit model in all cases. So we need to give thought to what that looks like and then capitalize on the learners' experiences, especially for those first generation students.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I'm going to ask our audience to join me in thanking our distinguished panelists for sharing their insights and perspectives. I thought it was a really rich discussion that highlighted the benefits of serving first generation adult learners, and also all the effective strategies from your vast experiences that you talked about. Thank you for sharing those. We also want to thank our audience for all of the work that you do or will do to support our first generation adult learners. It's really been a privilege to be with you this afternoon. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Maureen Hoyler.
Thank you so much to our panelists. It is so easy to overlook the unique motivation and potential that our adult first generation students bring to our campuses. But our panel certainly reminded us that to overlook that potential is done only at our own peril. If I have one thing to say to you today as you begin and look forward to your first generation celebration, is that we indeed celebrate. We know of so many things, policies, procedures, attitudes, crises on campus that have to be changed if we're truly going to have colleges that are hospitable for first generation students. But this is not a time for task lists. We are reminded daily of the amazing potential of first generation students. So when we have first generation day or month or week, it must be at its heart a time that we celebrate these students, their contributions to our campuses, and the potential that each of them possesses. We must take time to celebrate these students and to convey to them how much they are appreciated on our campuses and how much we trust in their futures.